Hello, mind mappers, and welcome to the video. Today we're going to be going over The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg, why we do what we do in life and business. This is one of the favorite books that I have on habits. I read it quite a few years ago and I'm revisiting it here today while I'm building my course all about habits. I think you're really going to enjoy this one. There's a ton of really great insight. This is kind of, for me, the grandfather of all of the habit books that I've read on the channel, and I wanted to come back and revisit it and explore it with you. I pulled out a quote that I believe gives us a good overview of what we can expect to learn. This book draws on hundreds of academic studies, interviews with more than 300 scientists and executives, and research conducted at dozens of companies. So it's a pretty well researched book, even though it's a few years old by now. It focuses on habits as they are technically defined, the choices that all of us deliberately make at some point and then stop thinking about it but continue doing, often every single day. At one point, we all consciously decide how much to eat and what to focus on when we get to the office, how often to have a drink or when to go for a jog. And then we stopped making a choice, and the behavior becomes automatic. It's a natural consequence of our neurology, and by understanding how it happens, you can rebuild those patterns in whichever way you choose. So, when does behavior become automatic? Everyone lives the majority of their life through habit, as he says here. We'll talk more about this later on in the mind map, but it's simply how we evolved as human animals. The brain is physically wired to live off of habit. Habits are neither good or bad, they're really just expected. However, of course, there are some habits that we want to keep and some habits that we want to create, or some habits that we don't want to have or don't want to pick up. This book is really all about this process of being the human animal and picking up habits along the way. What the habit building process is going to look like and what science can tell us about it, how we can create new wanted habits and get rid of our old unwanted ones, and why habits can sometimes be hard to break or to create, and some of the common misconceptions that go along with creating new habits or breaking bad ones. Really, what we're talking about here is how we can gain control of our lives. Every day, you can feel like you're living a Groundhog Day. You wake up and you do the same thing over and over and over again. And this is especially painful when you are taking part in a habit that you wish to get rid of, but you're finding it difficult. Constantly, you're doing the same thing day after day without being able to make a change. This book actually contains the process for how you can make that change and many others along the way. That's really what this is all about. Let's deconstruct how habits are being created and picked up along the way. We already know why they're being picked up. It's kind of hardwired into humans as animals. And after that, we're going to talk about exactly how you can create and how you can get rid of the habits that you don't want and the habits that you do want. Before that, let's talk a little bit about mind mapping. You can get the most out of these mind maps by following along. Find the process of how I mind map, plus all 50 plus mind maps available on the channel at the link down below. At that website, you can also find my masterclasses, which are essentially culminations synthesizing all of our mind maps together into core principles. I just did one on learning, and I'm going to be working on one on habits. That'll be the Habits Masterclass. Following along with these mind maps and those mind maps will help you learn more, remember better, and apply these books to your life. Our first big idea here is about effort. Habits, scientists say, emerge because the brain is constantly looking for ways to save effort. Left to its own devices, the brain will try to make almost any routine into a habit, because habits allow our minds to ramp down more often. The effort-saving instinct is a huge advantage. An efficient brain requires less room, which makes for a smaller head, which makes childbirth easier, and therefore causes fewer infant and mother deaths. An efficient brain also allows us to stop thinking constantly about just basic behaviors, such as walking or choosing what to eat, so we can devote mental energy to inventing spears and irrigation systems and eventually airplanes and video games. So habits have led to really all innovation. Habits are one of the main reasons that human beings are able to do what we're able to do. And they're really just the brain's way of saving effort. After all, the brain and the human animal is all about conserving energy. If you have to do something regularly, the brain will make it automatic. Do you ever feel like you've forgotten your entire drive home, maybe from work or from the gym? Of course, that's a huge thanks to your brain and making that automatic. Of course, it's also a little bit terrifying how powerful it is. You can forget an entire drive home because it's so automatic. Imagine how complex driving a car down the highway actually is, knowing where to turn, knowing how to drive the car, and etc. But because we do it so often, it becomes automatic. So even these very, very complex things like driving a car back to your house can end up becoming automatic. And this is why I actually said before that habits are neither really good or bad. Really, what habits are is just our brain's way of making something we do regularly automatic. Effort saving, right? Saving those calories for more important, potentially, things. Whether it's got a negative or positive outcome doesn't really matter to the brain. It's all about saving energy. A quick exercise that you can do here is test your own awareness. What are some habits that you're currently experiencing in your life, whether they're good or bad? Preferably, we want to spend some time looking at the ones that we didn't actually intentionally create. And we might not even think of these things as habits. Potentially, it's the way that you wake up first thing in the morning. Potentially, it's what you do before you go to bed. Potentially, it's what you do when you first get to work in the morning. Things that you might not have thought about before, but things that you've formed a routine around. Spending some of that time and reflection will give you a good idea of just how much of your life is built on habits. And with that idea, you can really know, hey, this kind of experience that I'm having is a lot of me just going on autopilot. And now that we're going to talk about how you can build the habits, really the habits that you have are what builds your life. And that's why we're talking about habits here today. And that's why I think habits are so important in any type of personal development. So, this process within our brains of creating habits is a three-step loop, the way that Charles explains it here. First, there is a cue, a trigger that tells your brain to go into automatic mode, which habit to use. And then there's the routine, which can be physical or mental or emotional. And finally, there's the reward, which helps your brain figure out this particular loop worth remembering for the future. So this three-step loop is really the foundation of the rest of our mind map. After we talked about effort, after we talked about why habits are so important, now we're going to talk about how we can actually go about changing them in our own life if we need to. If you want to create a habit, you need to take a look at each part of the loop. You need to look at the cue, the cue, the routine, and the reward. These three things are what lead to a habit. We'll cover more about each one of these three different things later on in the mind map, but for now, you just want to remember that anytime you're having trouble making or breaking a habit, you need to look at these three things. If you're having trouble making a habit, I would suggest you look deeply into the cue. If you're having trouble breaking a habit, then I would suggest you look deeply into the reward, or what are you getting out of the habit. Lots of different things. Quite often, if you've kind of bashed your head up against the wall trying to break a habit before, one of these three things you're not taking a look at. Maybe you're looking at the routine a little bit too deeply, not thinking enough about the cue, or maybe you're really having a hard time finding a way to reward yourself without the negative habit that is in place right now. All three of those are extremely important, and those three steps are what you want to remember going through the rest of the mind map here today. So now, like I said, let's talk about cue. If you want to start running each morning, it's essential that you choose a simple cue, like perhaps always lacing up your sneakers before breakfast or leaving your running clothes next to your bed, and a clear reward, such as a midday treat, a sense of accomplishment from recording your miles, or the endorphin rush you get from a jog. But countless studies have shown that a cue and a reward on their own aren't enough for a new habit to last. Only when your brain starts to expect the reward, craving the endorphins or the sense of accomplishment, will it become automatic to lace up your jogging shoes each morning. The cue, in addition to triggering a routine, must also trigger a craving for the reward to come. So the cue is definitely important. The reward is definitely important, but it's actually the relationship between the two that we're trying to use to create this habit loop. So the cue is only the start of the habit loop. Each step is important in and of itself, of course. The cue is one thing that I find that we often overlook, though. We often only think about the routine, what we want to actually do, the jogging, for example, and we think about the reward, right? We think about how we're going to feel after we get the thing done. But really, the cue is a huge part. And inside of Tiny Habits by BJ Fogg, he actually says that without that cue, as Charles Duhigg is calling it, no habit is ever going to actually get done, right? The cue is actually the most important part. So, how do we create a cue? From my experience, the easiest way to create a cue is to attach it to a habit of something that you're already doing. Now, a lot of you probably know that I've got this habit that I try and get everyone to get on, which is if you drink coffee or tea in the morning, turn that into a meditation for yourself. It's easier to attach a new habit to something that you're already doing than it is to create a new habit from scratch. Because if you attach it to a pre-existing habit, that's your cue. Going to sleep, right? You're going to go to sleep. You could attach a new routine, which is reading. You have a break at work. You could attach a new habit of breathing deeply during that time. But of course, Charles shows us here how we can set up the cue the night before, which is also super effective. He talks about lacing up your sneakers before breakfast or leaving your running clothes at the edge of your bed the next night. Whatever you decide to make it a clear cue that's easily set up and repeatable. So you want to make sure that the cue is happening ideally at the same frequency that you want to do the habit, and you want to make it so that the cue is easy to do. You want to make the cue as easy as possible. BJ Fogg, again, inside of Tiny Habits, he says, can we get something that is immediate and can we attach it to something that is already going on in our life? But of course, the cue is not enough. We talked about this before, and we're going to talk a little bit about it later. But the cue that we set up must actually lead to a reward if it's going to set up our habit loop, meaning that you must actually give yourself some type of reward, or the experience must be rewarding in and of itself to get you to actually stick to it. Right? A cue is not okay by itself. A reward is not okay by itself, but the relationship between the two, the cue leading to the feeling of I'm going to get a reward, is what we're actually looking for. So the cue must lead to a feeling of reward versus a feeling of work for it to stick. Right? If your cue is running shoes before you're ready to jog for the day, your cue is lacing up your running shoes, but all you think about when you're lacing up your running shoes is how terrible the jog is going to be. You're never going to make that stick. Instead, you need to train your mind to remember that endorphin rush, that midday snack, or logging your miles for the day. That's really what you want to get that cue to signify, is not necessarily a cue for work, but a cue that you're going to do an activity that's going to give you a reward at the end. So our next point here is Keystone, about Keystone habits. It wasn't the trip to Cairo that had caused shifts, scientists were convinced, or the divorce, or the desert trek. It was that Lisa had focused on changing just one habit, smoking at first. Everyone in the study had gone through a similar process. By focusing on one pattern, what is known as a keystone habit, Lisa had taught herself how to reprogram the other routines in her life as well. So this is really a really interesting story about Lisa and a bunch of other people in a study where they changed one habit, but that one habit changed their entire life. Got a little bit of a Lord of the Rings reference here for you nerds like me. One habit to rule them all. This is really all about the keystone habit and its effects. Charles tells us that this lady quit smoking, and that's all the study was really about. But it ended up changing her entire life. Some people might think that she actually had like some kind of psychotic break, because you see here that she went through a divorce, she went to a trip to Cairo, all these sorts of different things. But she didn't actually just throw her old life away. Instead, she simply changed one keystone habit for her, which was smoking, and that keystone habit led to a myriad of other changes in her life. What's the basic idea of keystone habits? The idea is that there's one habit in your life that if you changed it, it will have a huge outsized impact on you as a person, on you in your career, on you in your relationships, on you in every single area of your life. It'll change your preferences, your personality, and your self-confidence. Plus, it's usually one of the most difficult things that you're trying to either stop or to start, meaning that every other habit is a little easier after you've been through it. So you can see this lady quit smoking, and then it was a little easier for her to get up the courage to go through the divorce or go on a desert trek or go to Cairo. But really what it is here is you've been through something difficult. You've shown yourself that you're able to do it, and you literally changed your life by just changing one of your habits. So the question we want to get through here is, what are our keystone habits? What are the things that I could change right now such that everything else in my life would be a little bit easier? So think about the habit that will have the most positive impact on your life, whether it's quitting a habit or starting a new one. Either one of those can be a keystone habit for you. It could be something like exercising regularly, it could be quitting drinking, it could be meditating, it could be reading more. All of these things are going to be different for each of us, but we each, I believe, have one or two keystone habits that are going to make the big change in our life. So once you've made the commitment and changed that habit, the rest is going to be so much easier. You'll have newfound energy and be ready to tackle the next change head on. So instead of focusing on all the small little habits that you can build up, think about how can I make a change for one big keystone habit that's going to have an outsized return on my investment. Our next big idea here is believe. Such an important ingredient is self-belief. How do habits change? There is, unfortunately, no specific set of guaranteed to work steps for every single person. We know that a habit cannot be eradicated, it must instead be replaced. And we know that habits are most malleable when the golden rule of habit change is applied. If we keep the same cue and the same reward, a new routine can be inserted, but that's not actually enough. For a habit to stay changed, people must believe change is possible. And most often, that belief only emerges with the help of a group. So there are two ingredients to habit change. The first is the golden rule that he talks about here. When trying to change a habit, it's best that you keep the cue and the reward the same, but then change the routine, the thing that you do in the middle of those two things. By keeping those two things the same, you make it as easy as possible to change the habit. And this is what I was talking about before, where pick a habit that you already have and kind of graft that new habit onto that one. So, for example, drinking coffee in the morning and scrolling on Instagram is a favorite hobby of a lot of my friends. The cue is coffee, and the reward is, well, Instagram and coffee. Here we can easily replace the scrolling on Instagram with meditation and get the same cue and reward, but placing in a different routine, one that's ideally or probably going to lead you to a healthier day. So we have this other part, right? We've got this first part is the golden rule, these two ingredients for changing habits. The next is, of course, belief, or belief that we're going to be able to actually get this habit changed, belief that we have the ability to stay changed, and etc. For habit change to stay changed, you need to believe that change is possible. I wouldn't have said this a year ago. That's how fast our understanding is changing, said Duhigg, the University of New Mexico researcher. But belief seems critical. You don't have to believe in God, but you do need the capacity to believe that things will actually get better. So during their research, all these researchers have talked about, okay, here's the cue, here's the routine, here's the reward, but really you need to believe that you can change. And especially belief in change happens in groups. So essentially what you're doing here is you're not only, okay, I believe in myself, I believe that I have the ability to change, that's super important, but belief in groups is something a little different. Because if you can find a group of people that are making or trying to make the same change as you, it can be so helpful, extremely helpful. Seeing people who have done it before is a way to supercharge your belief that you can do it. And then you supporting people that, after you've done it, supporting people in that way as well can kind of reinvigorate your energy to continue with the habit change. That's why Alcoholics Anonymous and other anonymous type associations are so impactful in people's lives. Our next point here is about exercise. When people start habitually exercising, even as infrequently as once a week, they start changing other unrelated patterns in their lives, often unknowingly. This interesting effect. This is kind of a keystone habit that we talked about before, but it seems to work almost for everyone. Typically, people who exercise start eating better and becoming more productive at work. They smoke less and show more patience with colleagues and family. They use their credit cards less frequently and say they feel less stressed. It's not completely clear why, but for many people, exercise is a keystone habit that triggers widespread change. Exercise spills over, says James, a University of Rhode Island researcher. There is something about it that makes other good habits just a little easier. And for me, in my experience, exercise is this weird kind of magic elixir. Coming from owning my own gym when I was just young, I know this to be true. So often, people would come into the gym to lose weight, only to leave completely different people. I had one lady in my gym who was actually around the same age as me, and she lost over 100 pounds, which of course is just amazing, right? Losing 100 pounds changes your life in and of itself. But not only that, she had two or three different career changes while we were together. She was taking action for herself in her life, which she hadn't been doing before. She became a completely separate person. And it was really, really amazing to see that weightlifting and exercise had such a big impact on her life. They changed this one habit from being a non gym goer to being a gym goer, and it seemed to change their life. This story happened again and again and again, by the way. The losing 100 pounds is just kind of the main one that I remember. It's the one that sticks out in my head the most. Often people would switch careers, making huge life changes. This happened so many times, and just having kind of completely separate personalities. You would have people that came into the gym kind of meek and shy, and they would walk out and be the most confident person that you saw on the street. All because of the self confidence and self determination that they built inside of the gym. And it didn't happen all at once, by the way. It happened slowly but surely. The more exercise they did, the more weightlifting they did, the more confident they got, and the more they changed. Our final point of the day here is malleable. Hundreds of habits influence our days. And we talked about this before, just how much habits rule our lives. They guide how we get dressed in the morning, talk to our kids, and fall asleep at night. They impact what we eat for lunch, how we do business, and whether we exercise or have a beer after work. Each of them has a different cue and offers a unique reward. Some are simple and others are more complex, drawing upon emotional triggers and offering subtle neurochemical prizes. But every habit, no matter its complexity, is malleable. The most addicted alcoholics can become sober. The most dysfunctional companies can transform themselves. A high school dropout can become a very successful manager. However, to modify a habit, you must decide to change it. You must consciously accept the hard work of identifying the cues and rewards that drive your habit's routines and find alternatives. You must know that you have control and be self conscious enough to use it. And every chapter in this book is devoted to illustrating a different aspect of why that control is real. So again, he's saying here, no matter how complex or no matter how ingrained, every habit is malleable and changeable, which is certainly a message of hope to some of us, right? Habits with negative outcomes that have been in our lives for a very long time can feel almost totally immovable. Maybe you've tried to exercise and eat healthy a dozen times, but to no avail. That can make it feel like the habit just can't be changed. And of course, we've all been there before with different habits, I'm sure. But every habit is changeable, it is malleable, it's possible to change. That doesn't mean that they're all going to be easy, of course. Actually, we would do better to accept that every habit is actually going to be quite difficult to change. I think that sometimes we can read books on habits and think that we know scientifically how to change the habit, so it's going to be easier for us, which is probably true, but that doesn't mean it's going to be easy. Of course, we need to bring back our awareness and our willingness to change to these three steps. We need to identify our cues, what is causing the behavior, what is signaling our mind to go into that routine that we've made over the years. We need to craft our routine to give us the outcome that we want. We need to deliver the reward. We need to actually give ourselves something positive rather than just focusing on the work. And of course, there's a couple of bonus steps here. Continue to make the habit better. My idea here is start as small as you possibly can. Get a small cue, a small routine, and a small reward, and continue to make it better along the way. Try again if you fail at first, if your cue didn't work, if your routine didn't work, if you didn't feel the reward enough, if the relationship between the first and the last part of the habit loop didn't quite connect, try again because it's going to be difficult to change. You need to kind of play around with these three different steps, and that's okay. You need to try again, try again, try again. That's really what life is all about, is consistency and a willingness to stay consistent. Finally, a big point that I'm pulling through in a lot of these books is be self-compassionate. If you're not able to do a habit first try, don't beat yourself up about it, because quite simply, beating yourself up for not being able to accomplish something is really draining your willpower rather than filling up the tank. If you can spend some time saying what you did well and noticing yourself actually giving it a real honest try, that's going to fill up your willpower tank. That's really what we need when we're trying to create any new habit. I want to thank you for being with me here today. Again, you can go to themindmapguy.com and you can check out my masterclasses on things like learning and habit and purpose and willpower, all coming up. I hope to see you in the next video.